Hello everyone, welcome back to alkyne hydroxide 784 and I got my vaccine yesterday, so if I sound like weird then deal with it. So today we move on to a new theme, which is like, you know, I kind of came up with last minute, and I first came up with two topics, which is colonialism and climate change. So you might wonder whether the theme is stuff that starts with the letter C, but no, it's about things that affected history or the earth itself greatly. And maybe also start with the C, I don't know. I'll probably think of the other topics, although I'm not sure if China or um, COVID or Cold War is gonna actually feature as topics. Maybe some other topics. Anyways, so today's topic is colonialism. And yeah, as usual, I come up with weird topics. Never mind. So the whole premise of the theme is to see how these particular things affected the world greatly and see if there's any. Okay, I'm not sure if I actually have the actual exceptions to the rule, but maybe if there are, I might tell it. And by effect, it includes both positive and negative impacts. So yeah, that's just clarifying that. So, before we move to the impacts, let's talk about what colonialism and why it happened. So, colonialism happened because of, well, if you wanna summarize it like your secondary school history teacher, it's the three G's: God, glory, and gold. And it happened through ships and people who dared to come and wreak havoc on innocent strangers. And when did it happen? Actually, over many centuries, as early as around 1400 and as late as maybe around 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, I don't know, very late. And in some sense, it could still be a thing in quotation marks. So sure, colonialism definitely had a lot of time and chances to impact the world. And since this isn't the history series, I'll try not to talk too much about history and instead talk about the consequences. Okay, let's go then. So first, one of the ways that colonialism affected it is by directly affecting the history of many, many countries. And there are actually quite a few ways that this happens. So, the most obvious thing to me is the impact on language spoken in these countries. So let's say you look at the British Empire, which is like the Anglophone kind of thing. Actually, no, it's more than just Anglophone. And many of the colonized countries have English as either the official language or they actually use it in their education system or they talk about it a lot and things like that. And you can actually see it here. Isn't that cool? And yeah, we have many examples. Here in Singapore, our education system is in English. I'm speaking in English to you right now. And I mean, in Africa, there are some countries where the languages that they have officially is English as well. And in India, of course, many Indians know English pretty well and learn it in school, though it's not necessarily their main language, educational language. Yeah, it kind of depends on the state. Yeah, so apart from that, we even have the whole Anglophone world that is created because of colonialism. The fact that the USA, like USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, these countries are here because or like they are defined as English speaking countries because of colonialism. If not, I think their history would have been much more different and I don't know how it would have been. And if you want to talk about the Philippines, you can actually blame, Britain's kid, USA. Thank you very much, or not, I don't know. But yes, apart from English, we have another equally impressive big phone to challenge the Anglophone, and may I present to you the Francophone. Yeah, I guess this is about as much as I know. And you might be wondering why there's quite a few countries in northern Africa speaking French. Colonialism. Why Vietnam and Cambodia has French in school and in pamphlets and in the museum. Colonialism. Why you can travel from France to New Caledonia without really requiring a special visa or passport. Colonialism. Wait, what? Okay, never mind. But you get the point. Even France has been quite influential on today's state of affairs. And you can apply this to Spanish and Portuguese and even Dutch. I think Spanish and Portuguese is more in South America, and Dutch, I think, actually they did colonize a lot of places, but um, it either they colonized it first and then the British came along and took over, or like so their impact isn't as great. It's more of interspersed into the language. For example, Indonesian has some Dutch influence, and it kind of differs a bit from Malay because of that as well. Yeah, so there's all sorts of different European influences in languages today. So, what else can we attribute to colonialism? Well, the second thing I can say is for all the cultural influences. For example, sports. Well, cricket, it's technically from UK, but the people who care about cricket the most are Indians, and they are better than it than the British people themselves. And apart from the Indians, there's also like some of the other Anglophone countries and also Africa. Some African countries also send teams to play cricket. And yeah, I guess in a way, the fact that Indians are crazy about cricket is also fueled a bit by nationalism and a bit of vengeance on the people who once colonized them. Yeah, in a way, I believe that was the reason as well. Yeah, so apart from cricket, there's other examples. Hockey. Hockey is something Canadians like, and of course, it came from England and stuff like baseball. It came from England to USA to wherever else is influenced by USA. And soccer is kind of everywhere but officially from UK. Wait, is there anything that isn't attributed indirectly to UK? Okay, if you want to talk about France, honestly, the first thing that came to my mind is Pétanque. And I think an image will help you understand what that is. And it is played in the former colonies of France, so let's take that. I can also include stuff like cycling and tennis to some extent is somewhat the predecessor of it is in France, but end up going through UK again. So I don't know, but you get the point. So sports definitely did spread to certain places because of colonialism. So apart from sports, another big one is cuisine. The stuff people eat, and this kind of happened both ways. And for now, I'll just talk about the impact on the colonized. I think in terms of the colonized, well, for them the impact is more subtle because I think in general English food is generally considered to be quite bland and meh compared to our wonderful Asian food or African countries wonderful African food or some South American food for them. And yeah, like literally anywhere else seems to have better food than like original English food. Yeah, so you get the point. That's why the impact seems to be more present the other way around. And in fact, food was maybe one of the reasons, aka spices specifically, that colonialism happened. But anyway, I digress. The problem is it is quite hard to pinpoint if the influence is related to colonialism or more recent globalization. But there are definitely examples, and if the easy way to start is to start from here and then generalize it to everywhere. So, in Singapore, we have all sorts of cuisines all over the world, and that's because of globalization and, being a trading hub and everything. But I believe that Eurasian cuisine is quite, attributed to colonialism because, Europeans come here, then like either they are the colonists themselves or just coming here to trade stuff, and then they see some local women and fall in love with them and then make families and stuff, and then they create a nice little community and they create their own mixed cuisine. So this is probably also present in not only Singapore but in many Asian countries as well. And a lot of it is actually quite like influenced by Indian food as well. Even though technically I have no idea, I have not eaten any of those dishes because the modified version of original Indian dishes are usually not vegetarian. So yeah, but you can see what are the examples that you can see here. But yeah, that's I think the most obvious source of European influence on Asian cuisine. That's about as much as I can come up with. Yeah. But I think something that is more obvious, maybe because at least the French people have slightly better seeming food, is something that we all know as banh mi. The that Vietnamese dish, which is kind of like a sandwich. And the reason behind this is that the Vietnamese originally had to eat the French baguettes the usual way that the French like to eat it, which is kind of the slightly boring way. But once they managed to eat all the French out of there, they were quick to make it more worthwhile as a nice little sandwich, more Asian style, like put some Asian ingredients in there. And that became famous on its own. It's a perfect little takeaway meal that people can take and eat on the go. So yeah, that is probably the only legit example I can come up with. But apart from cuisine directly, we can also talk about something else that maybe you might have not talked about, which is how colonialism may have affected the dietary habits of indigenous tribes in maybe America or Polynesia. So what happens is, all the Europeans come to America to settle, and then they displace the native people. And because of that, the native people no longer have access to the rivers or the places where they actually go and get their food. I don't know, fish, the trees or whatever's around them. And in compromise, the colonists give them some sort of rations or something like that, which is more processed and more Western. And this isn't as healthy as the stuff that the natives had originally, which is getting stuff from the nature itself. And this led to this cycle of indigenous people having to eat unhealthy or processed food and becoming dependent on it until today. And now, there are quite some places in which they have higher obesity rates because they're kind of stuck in this, cycle of just eating processed food or cheap food because it's hard for them to actually get food naturally, and it's also hard for them to buy a more expensive, healthier food. Yeah, so that's actually another way you can look at it. So apart from cultural stuff, we can also look at the political history. I think some people like politics. And the way I can put it is that the process of exiting from colonialism, or how the colonialism affected the post-independence history, that kind of thing, that would have probably been a way to actually explain the impact of colonialism on various histories of different countries. So, I'm just going to say it in a general sense and maybe put the examples on the slides instead so you can look at it on your own. So some countries definitely experience some level of technological and economical improvement for some period of time, at least when they were colonies. Because the Europeans really like trading, and there are actually some places that are still major trading or shipping hubs for that matter after colonization was over. And even if I try to search for other examples, Singapore is the best example for this thing, like this point, because it is still a major shipping hub today. And I think it's also important to know that Singapore has been relatively lucky with regards to its experience, because it didn't have to, do have a very politically intense or like any war like kind of exit from the British rule. Of course, the Japanese part is a bit intense, and the British people came to so-called save us, but okay, they kind of failed us first and then they saved us and stuff. Okay, you get the point. But the actual exiting from British rule was more, calm. There wasn't too much, it wasn't too crazy. And that's why Singapore was able to stay in one piece and have all the stuff that they needed to continue being a good shipping hub, and still be a good shipping hub today. But anyways, I'm digressing. But apart from shipping and things like that, the economy also benefited from better infrastructure in some cases, because the Europeans come there to get gold. In order to get gold, they get some precious resources, and they sell the resources to get gold, right? But that means that most of the places will have the infrastructure or the like if once they get independent they can just pick up where the colonial powers left it and continue unless it gets destroyed in the war or something. But the money itself doesn't necessarily come to the colony, it's the colonized country all the time. It usually goes back to the European warlords because uh the colonial powers, which is very hard to say for some reason, but okay. So it really depends on how much money they give the colonized country or how much money to keep for themselves. There's a lot of factors to it. So yeah, let me talk about a few factors. The first one is how nationalized the country is in independence, or you can look at it at how violent independence was. Because if the country went through a pretty violent process, they generally have they had a war, they probably got a lot of destruction of stuff like infrastructure, and they had to rebuild themselves. But since it is quite violent, the people also have this sense of nationalism because they had a part to play in getting the country independent. They had this great narrative that, oh, okay, we kicked the colonial power out, and that allows the whoever's the ruling party or ruling person to rally everyone together and build up the country quickly. So there's two sides to the coin here. And this could mean that if you can end up getting an authoritarian state many times because since the people are willing to listen to anyone who is from their country and willing to lead them per se, even if that person is a bit authoritarian, they're willing to listen to them as long as it works and gives them some sort of economic growth. So that's the first factor. The second factor is how much preparation the leaders had before independence. So the colonial powers were bothered enough to teach the local politicians some stuff before they left, which is actually the case in Singapore and Malaysia. Then they have a higher chance of ruling better and the country fares well. But in some cases, since it's a violent process, there is obviously no chance for the colonial powers to slowly give power to the local people. And instead, sometimes the people who were the revolutionaries also don't really know how to run the country either. They fought the colonial powers, but they don't know what's next, and that could lead to further war or like um, just not a very good recovery or not a very good economic surge in a sense. So the third factor is resource curse, which I think is not purely colonialism, but also the whatever's inherently present in the geography of the country. So the resource curse is something that happens when you have too much of, like when you have a lot of natural resources, and this could happen in a case where the leaders are not properly prepared by the colonial powers or by anyone else, and they end up just depending on their natural resource because that's what is the easiest thing to take advantage of and get money from. But because of that, they don't focus on developing other sources of income for the country or other parts of the economy. And that could be quite problematic for them in the long term because eventually the natural resources are not going to be the like it'll probably stagnate or after some time like the increase in selling of those particular resources is going to stagnate, or maybe they'll run out of resources eventually. And I think one of the reasons why Singapore was pretty good going with in terms of the planning was because it didn't have the resource curse. It didn't have resources to begin with. So you're kind of forced to focus on stuff like shipping and other sorts of industries which are more adaptive to the future needs of the kind of the world and things like that. Yeah, so there we go. And the last factor is the unity of people after independence. So this is somewhat linked to whether the leaders are able to rally the people together, and it also depends on how nationalized everyone is. So before independence, everyone is probably very united because they all have the same goal of kicking the colonial powers out. But after independence, everyone has their own interest, and it really comes down to a power play or power struggle, and sometimes this could lead to more war and more tensions, which may not have happened if they had just continued being under colonial power. But that doesn't make sense to continue being under the colonial power. So maybe instead they should have a pact to not fight each other after finishing fighting all the colonial powers and sending them all the way. Okay, I don't know. Honestly, I'm not sure why why all of this happens, but it happens. It's just how people work. So yeah, basically, and it can the unity can also be affected by how nationalized everyone is, or like how fired up everyone is after fighting. So if there's like a full violent fight, then it's likely that their sentiments are still high, and that could be charged into other sentiments that they have against other people within their own country. And another thing that we can talk about is the fact that colonial powers may actually alienate certain parts of the country from other parts of the country. So let's say if the center is favored during the colonial rule, then maybe the people on the edges may want to be more separatist, or they realize that since the colonial powers are no longer there, they can try their best to leave the country or form their own country. And yeah, it's not only in Southeast Asia. Even in India, we have a whole breaking of India into India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. Basically, it broke up into three countries. Um, but yeah, this kind of stuff happens, and it's probably also influenced by the colonial powers rule, or maybe how they treat the different people differently in a sense. So, if you want more details if you're fine with the Southeast Asian examples, you can watch the history series video. So apart from stuff like this, there's also things that are like alliances or agreements. Like for example, the Commonwealth, which is practically just like all the Anglophone nations sharing a queen. I'm not sure if this is particularly significant, but okay, something that history related. And finally, to say something that okay, actually before I say finally, um, actually yeah, okay, I'll say this point first. The to top off the point of a country's history being literally determined by colonialism, apart from places like the US and Australia becoming mostly white people inhabited because of colonialism, we have a country that existed purely because colonialism happened, which is Mauritius, because it originally had dodos. There were no humans on that island, and all the poor dodos were killed off by humans, and the Europeans took hold eventually. So there were no native people there, at least in that sense. At least there were no people for them to brutally mistreat. Uh, but anyways, so what happened after that is that after that when slavery ended, a lot of Indian workers migrated there to work there, and now that place is just a mix of French culture and Indian culture. So yeah, interesting. So yeah, before we move on, one last thing I can quickly talk about is the destruction or stealing of artifacts. So remember that the colonial powers want money, and they also like to steal quite a few of important, maybe like god idols, or even statues of other significant figures, and they go and put it in their own museums, and it's very hard to get them back. Even nowadays, there's still some of these artifacts that are in British museums, for example, and it's still hard for Asian countries or African countries to get back these artifacts from the museum. Oh well. So you might be wondering, so how does this compare to an uncolonialized country? Basically, for example, Thailand. Thailand wasn't exactly colonized by anyone. It was just it just existed all on its own and managed to fight off most of the wars that it was in. Well, I guess there it's just many coups over coups and military and royalty having a little power triangle of their own with the politicians. Um, Actually, I guess the only difference is that since they don't have to worry about colonial powers, in order to talk about nationalism, they have to refer back to the king or the king, military, or the politician. Those are three people that people have, three parts of Thailand that people have to look up to, and they have to use certain ways to get people to have some sort of national sentiment. So that's the difference, I guess. I guess at the same time, they just probably follow the trends of other countries. They kind of like to take up alliances from the European countries or maybe even America, allow them to build military bases and stuff like that. So that's just how Thailand was. Right. Next point is globalization, because colonialization definitely impacted and maybe kick-started the whole act of globalization, because there were parts of the world that Europe never knew until they legit sailed there and found out and then misidentified that part of the world. You know what I'm talking about, Christopher Columbus. Yeah, so apart from stuff like that, they also, since they wanted the spices from everywhere, they had a trading routes, like they established trading routes to different coastal cities and ports and stuff like that. And this kind of kickstarted the global trade of rather than just in one segment of the world, it's literally including Europe as well. Before that there was the Silk Road. I think I'm not sure what's the difference between. I'm not sure there's much trading with North America until then, because I think this would have probably introduced more trading with North America and South America. Before that, it was mostly concentrated in Asia and Europe. Yeah, so you get the point. And of course, the cultural influence, but reverse, because more than Europeans influence our food, is more our food influencing European food. And this is most present in the fact that they really like spices, because the food was kind of bland and the spices really spiced it up. And yeah, there's quite a few examples of Indian food becoming modified for British people to eat and then becoming very famous and popular in Britain as comfort food, or just a very common food in Britain nowadays. Interesting. And likewise, I think there's many other examples of cultures and like cuisines that have been modified for European taste buds. And apart from cultural influence, we also have stuff like technological advancement. Okay, I think this is more indirect, because I feel like because the colonial powers managed to get a lot of money from all of this, and this allows them to fund their own advancement. They advance their own economy. They advance the industrial revolution and stuff like that. Get all the technological advancement, all this money, and that is the indirect effect of colonization. It made the colonized countries a bit poorer, and it made the colonizers quite a bit richer sometimes. So there we go. And yeah, apart from technological advancement, we can also talk about wars. And the war isn't just about trying to escape the colonial power. It's also about two colonial powers fighting over one location or multiple locations, in fact. It's kind of like how the USA managed to kick Spain out of Cuba and then decided to take Cuba for themselves, technically. Or like how Mauritius itself was first taken over by one European power, and then eventually they left, and then the French people came in and actually set up proper houses and stuff there, and the British decided to fight over the territory and kick the French people out. Yeah, stuff like that. So there's definitely wars or all sorts of territory. This leads to death and destruction, and that leads to removal of certain infrastructures in the countries that were colonized, and once again causing the colonized to be poorer than the people who colonized them. Oh well. And of course, the last one, the most pretty obvious, like now more obvious to us than ever, the spread of disease. And yes, this was a thing even in terms of colonization. I think you've heard of, if you actually read about like all the American history, I think one of the things you hear about is the fact that the people arriving in America brought stuff like smallpox and things that weren't common to the native people there, and that led to a lot of native people dying, and that was not good. And also they brought rats and other animals and things like that. Yeah, actually, you can say that the fact that globalization occurred due to colonization means that there are quite a few animals and there are quite a few crops that have spread to places that they wouldn't have otherwise spread to. Stuff like and this could lead to either, what's that term called, when invasive species accidentally killing off the native species there as well. So it's slightly different from diseases, but you get the point. It's quite similar logic. So yeah, colonization could have spread certain diseases as well as invasive species. So the final point that we'll be talking about today is racism. Uh, okay, so I think it's pretty obvious why you can attribute some like racism to colonization, partially because colonization involves one group of people presiding over another group of people and considering that other group of people as inferior, or in many cases there's even slavery involved and things like that. So because of this, the group of people that was considered inferior ended up facing racial problems even after independence happened and stuff like that. There was stuff like apartheid, and there was still discrimination against, for example, in America or even in Africa, there's discrimination against the black people by the white people, or if you want to be more politically correct, discrimination against African people by European people or other, I don't know, yeah, the colonizers in a sense. And yeah, that leads to certain cases of racism and stuff like that. And even in cases where it's not by the European people themselves instigating racism, it could lead to perception by other groups of people. Let's say if you're a minority in a country, you know, and you've had this history of being seen as inferior by Europeans, for example, then the other people in that country, maybe in America, for example, they could end up seeing minorities in a racist sense. There could be some people who are racist, and at the same time, there are also many people who are against this, which is a good thing, and are fighting back against the notion of racism. But yeah, the point that I want to make is that colonization could have definitely contributed a bit to the fact that racism exists today. And it's not just about direct racism, like people behaving, like considering other people inferior. It's also in systemic discrimination or racism in terms of like how, in America, for example, the African Americans generally tend to have a, because the original people who were slaves not didn't have as much income, or they didn't get the income that they, they rightfully needed, and also didn't really have rights to certain things like houses and things like that. And this spread even to till today, or quite a few generations, and still kind of is present, but in a much more subtler form. And yeah, that's pretty much the point to me. Yeah. So that's the last point. I think apart from that, there's nothing else much to really say. At the end, I put something called weird trivia that we haven't covered yet. Okay, the trivia, I guess, is just geographical spread of some of these countries. Like as I mentioned earlier, France is technically including New Caledonia, although I'm not sure if New Caledonia is trying to separate from France now. So if you were to go from the European pentagon, sorry, not pentagon, hexagon, to New Caledonia, which is nearby New Zealand, it's a really far distance, but technically you're still in France. But I think New Caledonia is trying to separate, so I'm not sure if it's still considered the same thing. If it's if the pact is still pact through or not. But that's funny. Okay. So the thing is, some of the countries still have territories all over the world, which is the weird trivia that I can share with you. And those particular territories have maybe their own governments, but at the same time they are kind of under the main country that originally colonized them. That's why I'm saying that technically colonization is not necessarily over fully because there are still territories that have been colonized and are still part of the country, which is a bit weird to consider. But anyways, that's the final last thought for me to leave with you. And I hope you find this video useful. If you did, please press the like button and subscribe. And with that, I would like to say thank you and bye.